In analytic philosophy, the rationalism-empiricism debate boils down to the following. Is there a priori knowledge? That is, do we possess any knowledge not initially received through experience? If so, how did it get there? If not, how do we know the truths that seemingly cannot be justified through experience? Bertrand Russell sheds invaluable light on this discussion. As we've seen, experience cannot justify some types of knowledge. But even if this is the case, we clearly learn such truths through experience. We first encounter a situation in which two things are mixed with two other things. We see that it makes a group of four things. Without any experience of countable objects, we wouldn't only be unaware that 2 + 2 = 4, we couldn't even grasp what such a statement means. The operation of addition would be as mysterious as some fake operation of, let's call it, Van Dusen. Furthermore, I may know that technically a singer Van Dusen a radiator results in an old blue jay, but unless through experience I can conceptualize this in some coherent way, my quote-unquote knowledge is hollow, and I can't really make robust sense of it. And in fact, is it really even knowledge? But due to some apparent miracle, the necessity of the situation is made immediately clear through experience, despite its inability to prove such a necessity. Bertrand Russell says, "We do not, in fact, feel our certainty that 2 and 2 are 4 increased by fresh instances, because as soon as we've seen the truth of this proposition, our certainty becomes so great as to be incapable of growing greater. I comprehend that there could be no outcome but a group of 4 things, and thus I find a truth that transcends particular cases and applies to all like cases, that is, a general truth. These statements, experience cannot justify belief in necessary truths, and we learn of necessities through experience, must not be mutually exclusive, since they're both clearly true. That, I think, is the invaluable insight that Russell had. These things are both true, and we know they're both true. But even if these are compatible, the difficulties remain. Our beliefs about necessities remain unjustified, or at the very least, we don't know what justifies our belief in the simple truths of math, given that our only resource for knowledge, that is, experience, is insufficient for this purpose. But does it make sense to think that though we know 2 and 2 are necessarily 4, we don't know why they are necessarily 4? Is it not the very difference between simple and complex math that simple math is inherently easier to grasp than complex math? But what does it mean to grasp something, if not, on some level, to go beyond the hollow affirmation of a fact and come face to face with that which justifies the fact? A small child could be taught to remember that E = mc², but the child can know this truth no more intimately than I know that a singer Van Dusen a radiator results in an old blue jay. It's a hollow fact, perfect fodder for rote memorization. And as I say that, I'm pleasantly surprised to find that Hegel made almost this identical point. Quote, "For mathematical truths, we should be even less inclined to regard anyone as a geometer who knew Euclid's theorems outwardly by rote, without knowing their proofs, without, as we might say, to point the contrast, knowing them inwardly. Similarly, if someone became aware, through measuring a number of right-angle triangles, that their sides do, in fact, have the well-known relation to one another, we should consider his mere awareness of the fact unsatisfactory." Unquote. Unlike the hollow fact, the perfect fodder for rote memorization, the child's knowledge that 2 and 2 are always 4 can be more robust. After adequate time, something solidifies within the child that immediately transforms the merely memorized fact into a now understood fact. This clicking into place, so to speak, is what it means to grasp, to understand, to learn. And this is precisely the way we come to know that 2 and 2 are always 4. The child's latter understanding is more robust than their former non-understanding. But what is this robustness other than intimate knowledge itself? But how is this knowledge learned? Through the clicking into place granted by experience. But haven't we established that no experience can justify this type of necessary mathematical knowledge? But we know we're justified in this knowledge. What is this clicking into place that justifies a priori truths? The problem persists. Kant, though earlier than Russell, provides a way of understanding the problem of a priori knowledge that attempts to save the empiricist claim that all knowledge comes through experience, while also making sense of the rationalist claim that some truths are undeniable and universally applicable, and in that sense necessarily true. He sought to solve the rationalism-empiricism debate by viewing a priori knowledge not as knowledge of necessary eternal truths, but as knowledge how, given the structure of the mind, we must think. According to Kant, intimate knowledge of a priori truths is a function of the way, quote, "our own mental apparatus orders this matter in space and time, and supplies the concepts by means of which we understand experience," unquote. And that quote actually wasn't from Kant, that was from Bertrand Russell describing Kant. In other words, a priori knowledge is not about objective reality, but rather our subjective representations of objective reality. Something must mold unstructured input, that is, sense data, into structured output, that is, human experience. This is precisely the role of the understanding, that which organizes and gives literal meaning and significance to experience. Human minds are fundamentally concept imposing. The mind applies concepts and gives form to the initially unorganized sense data received from our sense organs, thus producing a full perception, an experience of the world as relayed to us, the world translated to the language of our minds. This is not, however, the standard rationalist act of judgment. Perception of objects need not depend on willful categorizing. In fact, simple reflection on our perception shows that in most cases, we don't begin perceiving particular objects because of a decision to perceive as such. The process is more implicit, more concealed than this. Were gaining knowledge such a conscious and transparent process, the existence of epistemology would be absurd. Instead, our mode of learning depends on a mental faculty that is structured to perceive in a particular manner. Thus, when we perceive a priori truths, we are merely perceiving that structure without which we could not humanly perceive. Just as the cogito, the I think, therefore I am, is necessarily true for anyone who thinks of it, a priori truths are necessarily true for anyone who thinks of them because they are nothing but that which is required for all human perception. They are its prerequisite. Our undeniable beliefs, quote, are subjective. They are part of our apparatus of perception. But just because of this, we can be sure that whatever we experience will exhibit these characteristics. Unquote. That, again, is not Kant, but Bertrand Russell describing Kant's view. Unfortunately, Kant's view implies it's impossible for us to know reality in itself. Reality in itself, unexperienced, must exist, though we can know nothing of it, as all knowledge presupposes experience. We can't know anything about it, only that it is. There are no immediate, raw perceptions, because perception does not arise apart from the structure provided by the understanding. I never experience the tree itself. I experience my mind's categorization of all the sense data received from looking at what I will, in the end, label the tree. But, of course, this implication can't be too jarring. After all, humanity has long distinguished between appearance and reality. To some, Kant's view is satisfactory. To others, it is very lacking. Admittedly, Kant must be on to something here. Perception takes a form. It is organized. Now, this is either explainable or unexplainable. The latter option is unacceptable, as it would make my perception completely arbitrary. An idea that I take to be so repulsive to both reason and experience that its only conceivable purpose is to serve as a reductio ad absurdum. Something is responsible for my perception's organization, its structure. The primary dissatisfaction with Kant's explanation of a priori knowledge is that it makes what are seemingly objective and necessary truths a product of seemingly contingent mental constitution. Here's a quote from Bertrand Russell critiquing Kant. Quote, "The thing to be accounted for is our certainty that the facts must always conform to logic and arithmetic. To say that logic and arithmetic are contributed by us does not account for this. Our nature is as much a fact of the existing world as anything, and there can be no certainty that it will remain constant. It might happen, if Kant is right, that tomorrow our nature would so change as to make 2 and 2 become 5. This objection utterly destroys the certainty and universality which Kant is anxious to vindicate." Unquote. My mind's constitution today does not imply it will be so constituted tomorrow. So the a priori truths I accept tomorrow may conflict with those I accept today. Why, then, should I even believe today's? This, again, is a repetition of what empiricists have noted since Hume. Experience cannot justify the necessity of a priori truths. At least on the rationalist conception of knowledge, necessary a priori truths were grounded in a sufficiently necessary source, even if the connection between source and receiver remained a mystery, so to speak. Kant's view, while explaining why humans are so convinced of a priori truths, that is, we couldn't not believe them, fails to explain why a priori truths are, in reality, necessarily true. Why they are true not only of all experience, but of everything. Quote, "Two physical objects and 2 other physical objects must make 4 physical objects, even if physical objects cannot be experienced." Unquote. That's Bertrand Russell. Were I and every other subject exterminated, it would still be true that 2 and 2 make 4. Thus, Russell again, quote, "No fact about the constitution of our minds could make it true that 2 and 2 are 4. Unquote. We still have not identified why reality always adheres to the a priori truths with which we are familiar. We've merely learned that humans are forced to experience reality along certain lines. Russell points out another problem with Kant's theory, which, in my view, is the same problem just in a different light, or the same problem expanded. Quote, "What induces me to arrange objects of perception, as I do, rather than otherwise? Why, for instance, do I always see people's eyes above their mouths and not below them? According to Kant, the eyes and the mouth exist as things in themselves, and cause my separate percepts. But nothing in them corresponds to the spatial arrangement that exists in my perception. Kant holds that the mind orders the raw material of sensation, but never thinks it necessary to say why it orders it as it does and not otherwise." Unquote. Nietzsche had a similar gripe, of all people. He sort of mocked Kant. He said, quote, "How are synthetic judgments a priori possible? By means of a means," Kant had said. But is that an answer? An explanation? Or is it not rather merely a repetition of the question? How does opium induce sleep? By means of a means. Unquote. The mind structures according to categories, but why these rather than those categories? And why categories in the first place? The explanation why the mind orders as it does is, in essence, the law according to which the mind operates. Because it's unclear why the mind orders as it does, this is Russell's second objection, it is also unclear why the mind's ordering stays consistent over time, Russell's first objection. Another way of understanding Russell's point is by distinguishing between necessary truths of reality, that is, a priori facts, and our understanding that these truths are necessary, a priori knowledge. Even if we explain where and how a priori knowledge arises, this doesn't explain why there are a priori truths that can be known in the first place. Russell's critiques are more like complications to be worked through than outright refutations of Kant, and the point remains that perception is ordered, and its order has an explanation. If we can somehow remove the arbitrariness of the mind's constitution, we can potentially answer Russell's critiques. That said, Russell is correct that Kant's view cannot explain why we have these rather than those categories. I suspect this is largely because Kant sees humans as a combination of both mind and matter, though admittedly his view was that the mind is spatially extended to encompass the body, and that's a big step towards a unification of mind and body. As it was pointed out to traditional rationalists, if the mind is viewed as radically separate from the physical, a perfectly free, non-physical, purely mental substance, as traditionally conceived, then it certainly is a mystery why the mind organizes as it does. One would think such a mind could organize sense data any way it wanted. It's an autonomous will, after all. But not even the Kantian introduction of a mental apparatus, presumably acting according to laws of thought similar to natural laws, not even that can save the necessity of a priori truths, because it's unclear why the mental apparatus is structured as it is. And the structure is unclear because it is a mental apparatus, and as such has no clear connection to the workings of physical bodies. So long as the connection between mind and body remains mysterious, it will stay mysterious why the mind categorizes as it does. We also cannot interpret this talk of structure figuratively to mean something like the way the mind operates, because then Nietzsche and Russell's critiques eternally remain. The mind operates according to a structure is simply equivalent to the mind operates according to how it operates. And this makes no explanatory progress. The mental structure must literally be real. But what is it? More incisively, what could it possibly be? The very concept of a mental apparatus, a mental thing with a structure, is somewhat unclear. Traditionally, minds are non-spatial and immaterial, but the only concept we have of structure relates to some kind of spatial or temporal order, like a table or a debate. Clearly, something traditionally mental cannot be spatial, though it may be possible that minds are inherently temporal. Regardless, the temporality of minds couldn't possibly explain the mental structure at a particular moment. For To say that minds are temporal is only to say that a temporal thread runs through the mind's different moments, and it's left open why any particular moment of the mind is as it is. Furthermore, if each moment must exist non-spatially, then there are literally no lines. Lines in the very brute, physical, geometric sense. What, then, constricts the mind to thinking along these rather than those lines? Now, some might object to that and say, well, look, to say that you think along certain lines is just a figure of speech. It's not meant to be taken literally. But I think actually, when you think about sort of what it would mean to think along certain lines, it just means that your thought takes a certain path. And in the brain, that's literally true. Even granting there may be some reason my mind is tethered to a certain mode of thought, this reason has yet to be found, and it's difficult to say with any confidence that such a reason could possibly be found. Why aren't minds autonomous, rationalist judges? What non-physical barriers could limit the mind? Is the concept of a non-physical barrier even coherent? Why are the processing speeds of some mental apparati faster than others? Again, speed is traditionally a physical concept. Distance over time. Are we to think of mental speed differently? Perhaps figuratively as the number of mental processes completed over time? Then the question remains why a mind runs at this rather than that speed. We again run into a dualistic problem. We could describe the mind as literally having qualities traditionally taken as physical, like lines, speeds, boundaries. But it remains mysterious how this is even possible. That is, why these physical properties have anything to do with the mental, or what this even means. Like, what is a literal mental line? What is that? Does it mean anything? Does it signify anything? On the other hand, if talk of mental things having physical qualities is taken figuratively, that is, speaking of something mental as if it were a physical thing, we need not ascribe a literally physical property to a literally mental thing. But the mind's constitution nevertheless remains arbitrary. And again, Russell's critique is sound. There is no discernible reason why the mind operates as it does. These considerations hint that there is one shared ground on which lines, speeds, and barriers of both thought and matter are connected, rather than two split grounds, one with mental lines, speeds, and barriers, and the other with physical lines, speeds, and barriers. That said, this is far short of a proof. We could try eliminating this arbitrariness while still maintaining a classic mind-body distinction by thinking of the mind's capacities and structure as somehow originating from the physical body and the natural laws upon which it is built. If this is true, it's clear why the mind organizes as it does. The body, working in accordance with the laws of nature, provides the literal conduits and systems through which experience is generated and without which it's impossible. The mind is structured, operates at differing speeds, and is confronted with barriers because the body is structured, operates at differing speeds, and is confronted with barriers. This is why minds are not perfectly rationalist judges. The obvious difficulty with this suggestion has already been stated. The mind-body problem. How can something physical, acting according to any set of laws, give rise to something mental? How could something physical affect or be affected by something mental? It seems like a category mistake. The mental and physical appear to stand on no common ground. At this point, we must move beyond specifically a priori truths and critique the empiricist and rationalist understanding of perception and lived experience in general. For they each have their answers, and their answers shed light on the physical-mental distinction.